is something that has become prevalent with athletes and things like that. And so Chase is going to tell us what's the big deal about the flat earth theory. Go ahead, Chase.
I'll take the jacket off for this one. You laugh now, but wait. I'm going to get all sorts of weird things on my computer now from having to look this thing up. All right, so to start off with, Jeremy was not kidding when he said this is becoming more prevalent. There are some very notable individuals. Well, I say notable. I guess it depends on if you actually pay attention to them or not. Then they may be notable. That subscribe to this. It's a conspiracy theory is basically what it is. For those of you that don't know what the flat earth conspiracy theory is, basically it says this, and I got this from livescience.com, and these are quotes that I got off the website just to kind of bring you up to speed in case you don't know on what flat earth theory is, and you say, well, it means the earth is flat. There's a little bit more to it than that. It goes a little bit deeper. But livescience.com says the leading flat earther theory holds that Earth is a disk with the Arctic Circle in the center and Antarctica, a 150-foot tall wall of ice around the rim. Yes. NASA employees, they say, guard this ice wall to prevent people from climbing over and falling off the disk. Earth's day and night cycle is explained by positing that the sun and moon are spheres measuring 32 miles that move in circles 3,000 miles above the plane of the Earth. Stars, they say, move in a plane 3,100 miles up. Like spotlights, these celestial spheres illuminate different portions of the planet in a 24-hour cycle. Flat earthers believe there must also be an invisible anti-moon that obscures the moon during lunar eclipses. It gets better. Furthermore, Earth's gravity is an illusion, they say. Objects do not accelerate downward. Instead, the disk of Earth accelerates upward at 32 feet per second squared, 9.8 meters per second squared, driven up by a mysterious force called dark energy. As for what lies underneath the disk of the Earth, this is unknown, but most flat earthers believe it is composed of, quote, rocks. Then there's the conspiracy theory. Flat earthers believe photos of the globe are photoshopped. GPS devices are rigged to make airplane pilots think they're flying in straight lines around a sphere when they're actually flying in circles above a disk. The motive for world government's concealment of the true shape of the Earth has not been ascertained, but flat earthers believe it is probably financial. In a nutshell, it would logically cost much less to fake a space program than actually have one, so those in on the conspiracy profit from the funding NASA and other space agencies receive from the government. The Flat Earther website's frequently asked questions page explains. The theory follows from a mode of thought called the zetetic method, an alternative to the scientific method developed by a 19th century flat earther, in which sensory observations reign supreme. Broadly, the method places a lot of emphasis on reconciling empiricism and rationalism and making logical deductions based on empirical data. So basically, if you can observe it, then that must mean whatever you observe is true. Flat Earth Society Vice President Michael Wilmore, an Irishman, told Life's Little Mysteries, in zetetic astronomy, the perception that the Earth is flat leads to the deduction that it must actually be flat. The anti-moon, NASA conspiracy, and all the rest of it are just rationalizations for how that might work in practice. Is everyone following me so far? Yes, there are people who actually believe this. I have lost a lot of faith in humanity after researching this over the past few days. No, this is legitimately what people believe. There are some people who genuinely believe that this is the truth. So, what does this have to do with the Bible? Well, I guess the question stems from, what does the Bible have to say about all this? Does the Bible mention the earth being a certain shape? Does it talk about the earth being a certain way? And there were a couple of articles I found from Apologetics Press that kind of talk about this a little bit, and we're going to look at a couple of those and a couple of the verses that people who believe the flat earth theory will point to as qualifying or as saying that the earth is actually flat. The first article it's called Flat or Spherical Earth, Evaluating Astronomical Observations. This is a part 2. There's Alana May, Masters of Science, and Brandon May, which is a PhD, and I'm not sure what his PhD is in, but astrophysics, that's what his PhD is in, states that most people throughout the past believed the earth was round, and they had various methods of proving this belief. We teach in history class a lot of times, I say we as Americans, that back in the time of Galileo and in the time of Columbus, everyone believed the earth was flat, and if you sailed far enough, you'd fall off. That is not true. Most people understood or had a theory that the earth was in fact round. Now, no one was ever able to prove this because there's not really a good way to sail all the way around the earth. But throughout history, dating back to the time of ancient Greece, philosophers had theories of how, and mathematicians, how they could calculate and figure out for themselves that the earth is actually round. So this isn't a new idea, but it's one that everyone has basically been dismissing for thousands of years at this point. The first verse that people point to say that the earth is flat is Isaiah chapter 40, verse 22. And I'm using the English Standard Version for this one. It says, "It is he who sits above the circle of the earth, and its inhabitants are like grasshoppers, who stretches out the heavens like a curtain and spreads them like a tent to dwell in." Now, if you're reading from a different version, maybe New King James, your version will actually say, "It is he who sits on the circle of the earth." And this is where people get the idea of the earth being flat. God is sitting on a circle, so therefore the earth must be flat. The problem with that, well, there's a couple problems. Number one, Isaiah right here is using poetic license. He is not being literal when he's saying these things. You and I, those who live on the earth, we're not like grasshoppers. I don't see anybody jumping around on two big old back legs, rubbing their legs together, making noise. That's not true. The heavens aren't a curtain. Space is not a tent. But it's a poetic figure of speech to explain something that really is indescribable and inexplainable. How do you explain to somebody that God is who he is? How do you put that into terms that the human mind can comprehend? We can't. But poetically, we can get close or come to some degree of understanding. So in this verse, circle of the earth, the word for circle that is used can actually be translated disc as well, and that's a Hebrew word, so I don't know what that is. I didn't study Hebrew, but it actually should be translated or could be translated disc. And so people say, well, it's a disc, so the earth is flat. However, the actual, I did write it down. The actual word used for circle, and I'm sure I'm going to butcher this, chug or chug, I'm not sure exactly how it's pronounced, would be better translated to more likely mean vault. And if you think of it in terms of like a vaulted ceiling, it's a almost, maybe that's not the right way to put it, but it's supposed to give the idea of a dome shape. So if this word can be translated to mean vault and would be better translated as the word vault, implying that there's a dome, well, then that would mean that the rest of the earth, if the top is a dome, then the bottom would logically have to be another half of a dome. It would make a sphere. The word that is translated on, and apparently I couldn't find this version, can also be translated as above. And in the English Standard Version and the New American Standard, it is translated above instead of on. But it can be translated as saying above, which I think probably better gets the idea of what's going on here. So that's one of the verses that is used. But again, we're talking about poetic license here. This is not a literal word for word. This is exactly how things are. Another verse that people will point to is Joshua chapter 10, verses 12 through 13. Joshua 10, 12 through 13. Again, I'm going to be using the English Standard Version. You know that you've heard this story before, but this is the story of Joshua and the sun standing still while the Israelites are fighting against the Amorites. In Joshua 10, verses 12 through 13, it says, "At that time Joshua spoke to the Lord in the day, when the Lord gave the Amorites over to the sons of Israel, and he said in the sight of Israel, sun, stand still at Gibeon, and moon in the valley of Ajalon. And the sun stood still, and the moon stopped, until the nation took vengeance on their enemies. Is this not written in the book of Jashar? The sun stopped in the midst of heaven and did not hurry to set for about a whole day. So, what does this have to do with the flat earth? Flat earth theorists, and I got this from a different Apologetics Press article titled, Does the Bible Teach a Flat Earth? This is written by Justin Rogers. Some of you may actually know him or have heard him speak before. But he says, flat earth theorists also cite the interruption of the sun to, quote, prove their theory. The passage reports the sun stopped and the moon stood still until the nation avenged its enemies. The sun stood still in the middle of the sky and did not hurry to go about an entire day. Flat earth theorists, who apparently also defend a geocentric model of the solar system, so for those of you that don't understand that or don't know what that means, flat earth theorists say that the earth is the center of our solar system, not the sun, argue this passage certifies their position. They argue that according to the standard heliocentric, or the sun being the center of our solar system, model, the sun standing still would not interrupt the day at all. The earth, heliocentrists argue, revolves around the sun. In order for the Bible and the heliocentric model to be true, the earth would need to pause its rotation on its axis in order for the sun to appear to stop. But the Bible does not say the earth stops, it says the sun stops. Therefore, flat earth theorists adopting a geocentric model argue the earth must be fixed and the sun revolves around it. So that's a lot of information to process and a lot of big words there. So basically what they're saying is most flat earth individuals believe that the earth is actually the center of the solar system instead of the sun being the center of our solar system, which I'm not really understanding because it's called a solar system, as in, the sun is kind of important in it. And so they actually believe that because the earth is the center of the universe, and it's a disk, then the sun would be able to stop and the moon would be able to stop. But here's the thing. The Bible does not say that the earth stops. It says the sun stops moving. But again, we kind of do that ourselves. When night is coming and day is ending, we say that the sun is setting. The sun doesn't actually set. It keeps going. I guess it doesn't really move if you subscribe to the sun being the center of the universe. The sun doesn't set. It can't set. The moon, it rises and falls. The moon doesn't rise and fall. It doesn't do any of that, but we say that as an expression to describe an event in our lives so that we can better understand it. The point being, these two verses that are the most heavily used with flat earth theorists, first off, you are using poetic license as actual scripture. You are quoting poetic speech as being binding, which we know is not true, because if you took every single word in the Bible as literally, there's a few things in there that don't quite jive. And if you've been reading through, you understand what I'm talking about there. But these verses do not support the flat earth theory. And if anything, I would say Isaiah chapter 40, verse 22, because of the words used, would actually say that the earth is round, that it is a round, sphere shaped planet, and that no, the Bible does not support a flat earth theory. So now you've been educated on what flat earth is, and kind of talked a little bit about where the Bible stance is on it. The Bible doesn't go into huge detail about it, but I would say from the language here, and especially Isaiah, the verse in Isaiah, earth is a sphere. It's not flat. We've been to space. I've seen the rockets myself. I lived in Huntsville. It's real, I promise you. It's round.
Well, and the fun part is the kid that asked that question is not even here to hear it. So you get to explain that to them later as well. Butch, you don't get 15 minutes like Chase took on this next question. But this is one of the other ones that was submitted by young people. And these are some pretty specific questions, and Butch is going to answer them for us and deal with the principle as well. Can women teach boys in Bible class, and can a woman lead a man in prayer? Brother Butch.
have your Bibles, you might want to turn over to 1 Corinthians chapter 14. The Apostle Paul in 1 Corinthians is talking about the spiritual gifts in chapter 12 and chapter 13. He talks about the fact that many of those gifts were going to cease. He says, when that which is perfect is come, that which is in part will be done away. Chapter 14 goes ahead and talks about spiritual gifts, especially speaking in tongues. And if you notice in the King James Version, it talks about unknown tongues. That word unknown is in italics. It's not in the original language. But in 1 Corinthians 14, before Paul gets through, he talks about women's role in the church. Verse 33, beginning there, he says, "For God is not the author of confusion, but of peace, as in all the churches of the saints. Let your women keep silence in the churches, for it is not permitted unto them to speak, but they are commanded to be under obedience, as also saith the law. And if they learn anything, let them ask their husbands at home, for it's a shame for women to speak in the church." That's through verse 35. The question that was asked is, can women teach older boys? I know that there's quite a discussion about this many times, especially when a young boy obeys the gospel, maybe at 8, 9, even 10 years old. Can a woman that's a Christian teach him? He mentions the law. If you go back under the Old Testament law, a young man didn't become considered a man until age 12. And if you've got any Jewish friends, you know that they still have that practice today of acknowledging young men when they turn 12 years old. That certainly, I don't think, makes them a man, but at the same time, they're recognized at that particular point. The Bible talks about the fact we don't want to make anybody stumble. Sometimes the safest thing we can do is to have a man teach any young boy that obeys the gospel. That removes all doubt. Is it a sin? Would it be wrong? I personally would not have a problem if my son or grandson obeyed the gospel at 9 or 10 for a lady to teach him. He's still learning. He's still very much young, and I would not be opposed to that. That's personal. That's my opinion. If he's 12, 13, 14 years old, yes, I think the safest thing we can always do is to have a man teacher over those young men. The second part of that question is, can a woman lead a non-Christian man in prayer? I don't know who asked the question. Is that person here?
I don't know.
Okay. Turn with me over to Acts 19. We realize that there is limitations in the church as to the women's role. And I realize that we certainly want to make sure that we stay within bounds in doing this. I said 19. We're actually going to chapter 18. You might remember that on Paul's missionary journey, Aquila and Priscilla traveled with him. It just so happened that one of the places they went was they met a man, Apollos, chapter 18, verse 24. And it talks about this man. He said he was born at Alexandria, an eloquent man, mighty in the Scriptures, and he came to Ephesus. This man was instructed in the way of the Lord, and being fervent in the Spirit, he spake and taught diligently the things of the Lord, knowing only the baptism of John. He began to speak boldly in the synagogue, whom when Aquila and Priscilla had heard, they took him into them and expounded to him the way of the Lord more perfectly. And when he was disposed to pass into Achaia, the brethren wrote, exhorting the disciples to receive him, who, when he was come, helped them much which had believed through grace. For he mightily convinced the Jews, and that publicly showing by the Scriptures that Jesus was Christ. It doesn't say that it was Aquila alone that taught this gentleman. It says Aquila and Priscilla. Ladies, I think there's definitely a role for you in the Lord's church. And I think private teaching is one of those great ways in which you can do that. Just because it's male don't mean you can't share the gospel with them. And I know that there are many ladies that have taught others the gospel. Can she pray? Well, she would be in the presence of her husband. Can a woman lead prayer in the presence of her husband? That wasn't the question. I'll leave that with you today. for you to think about. Can a woman pray in the presence of her husband? Or is it so that the husband has to do all the prayer leading because of 1 Corinthians 14? Is it possible for a woman to lead prayer if it's a non-Christian? Well, if Priscilla was able to break the word of the Lord along with her husband Aquila to this gentleman, could she also have led him in prayer? I'll let Jimmy and Chase make comment about this, and I think sometimes there's a safe way to view things. The safest view would have been for Apollos to have led them in prayer had they had prayer. But I do believe she was able to take God's word along with Aquila and break the word to this gentleman. I also like the great description it gives of him. He had a fervent desire to speak up about Jesus. He just didn't know. He had only heard the preaching of John, and after they were able to share with him, it says that he very eloquently went about preaching the gospel other places that he traveled. Jimmy?
Chase, go ahead. I don't have a lot to add to that. I think that one of the areas that we really struggle with is for every person finding their role and finding what they can do. And there are areas like this where we have to sit and study, and we certainly, as Butch mentioned, always want to err on the side of caution, making sure that we're pleasing to God. But we know that men and women both have tremendous gifts to offer in the Lord's church, and we need to do whatever we can to take advantage of that. That's really all I have to add. Thank you for answering it. Anything else? All right, let's move on as we continue through. This question was posed as it relates to dealing with different issues that go on in the world. And the question is, are we supposed to be tolerant? That's often a word that's thrown around, that Christians are so intolerant that we are not willing to accept things. And I did a lesson some time back. I don't even remember where it was. I know it wasn't here, but it was about being narrow-minded. That's an accusation that's thrown at us a lot, being narrow-minded. The definition of narrow-minded is having or showing a prejudiced mind as persons or opinions are biased. The second definition, not receptive to new ideas, having a closed mind. So you hear the accusation leveled at Christians. I can imagine somebody from the world sitting and listening to Butch answer that question and say, how can those people be so narrow-minded, so closed-minded, so ingrained in a patriarchal society of times past, and they wouldn't be willing to hear that. They say those people are so closed-minded and so intolerant. But there's a quote that I really like. It says, merely having an open mind is nothing. The objective of opening the mind, as in opening the mouth, is to shut it again on something solid. I like that quote. So I think sometimes that we think that the more accepting we are of behaviors, the more tolerant we are towards people, the more open-minded we are, that we just sort of go with the flow and let things happen, and that makes us, the world would tell us, a better person. That we should just be willing to accept anybody as they are and not ever ask them to change who they are as a person. And that sounds really good. And the Bible tells us absolutely that we should speak the truth in love. But if we really love people, we're not going to be accepting of ungodly behavior. And so are we supposed to be tolerant? Yes, we're supposed to be tolerant of people. Are we supposed to be tolerant of sinful behavior? Absolutely not. And so it's really hard to deal with that. But I think that this starts, though, with us knowing where we stand and knowing what we believe. One of the things that happens to us sometimes is we don't have the right foundation. We're not rooted and grounded in our faith. And so when somebody throws one of these challenging questions at us or makes one of these accusations about being intolerant, we sort of don't know how to handle it. There's two verses that I really like that talk about those. The first one is one of the most often quoted verses I know from my preaching, and Butch's. Brother Curtis loves this verse as well. Ephesians 4, verse 14, so that we may no longer be children, tossed to and fro by the waves and carried about by every wind of doctrine, by human cunning, by craftiness and deceitful schemes. But rather speaking the truth in love, we are to grow up in every way into him who is the head, into Christ. Romans chapter 16, starting in verse 17. This is from the English Standard Version. It says, I appeal to you, brothers, to watch out for those who cause division and create obstacles contrary to the doctrine that you've been taught. Avoid them. For such persons do not serve our Lord Christ, but their own appetites, and by smooth talk and flattery they deceive the hearts of the naive. In Galatians, Paul said anybody that taught any other gospel than what they brought, they should consider them accursed. And so we've got to know what the truth is. We've got to be grounded in it, and then we can take that and share it with the world. We're supposed to be tolerant of people. We're supposed to be loving and compassionate and merciful, all the things that we talked about, those characteristics of the Father in the parable of the prodigal son. But it doesn't mean that we tolerate sinful behavior, because if we tolerate sinful behavior, then we're no different than anybody else in the world, and this message of salvation becomes null and void. So the answer is yes, we're tolerant of people, but no, we're not tolerant of sinful behavior. Anything to add to that as we continue along?
It's really, there we go. It's really ironic to me, and I don't know if y'all have found this to be true. These same people who are screaming at us to be tolerant, when we try to express our views and our ideas, have you ever noticed that it seems like they're, I don't know, lacking tolerance towards us? Because you see, the root problem has nothing to do with this. The root problem has to do with this. Because in the world today, what people want is what they want. It's their desires and their passions. And when you go to tell them that something that they are doing is wrong, they feel attacked, they feel threatened, and they will fight tooth and nail to keep doing what they want to do. And so ultimately that springs from the heart issue that a lot of the world has today. It's not a matter of they truly believe that we're intolerant. It's a matter of you're telling me I can't do something I want to do, and I'm not okay with that.
I think that's a good answer. I really believe that someone once said that the root of the problem is the heart. And I really hope that we can understand that not only do people talk about that, I think we need to make sure that we show them. There was a point in time that Jesus drove the money changers out of the temple, but you got to also look and think about what point did he do that? He spoke to a Samaritan woman at the well. That was unheard of. That was something that was taboo at that day. A Jew did not go into Samaria and speak to a woman. And yet Jesus dared to do that. And it's interesting. He sent his disciples away to get lunch that day. While they were gone, he had a conversation with that lady. Sometimes we've got to realize that the world may not understand what we're all about. But we got to walk in the steps of Jesus. We got to follow the example our Lord left for us, and that changes us. We're not the same after we become a Christian, or at least we're not supposed to be the same. And I really think that helps us sometimes to realize we've got a pattern. We've got someone who left the example for us, and that's what we're supposed to be. We fall short. We make mistakes, but hopefully we get back up and we get back on track and we follow those steps.
The areas where this is becoming problematic has to deal with specifically homosexuality and transgender issues. And Andrew Kingsley lucked out, and he's going to be the one that gets to deal with that topic in our summer series in a couple of weeks. But, for some reason we have this opinion that, well, the world now is a more evil place than it's ever been, and these things are popping up, and these things have been around since the Bible times. You can read about them in the Old Testament being talked about and dealt with. And so, Ecclesiastes says there's nothing new under the sun, and we know that that's true. And just as there's nothing that's new under the sun, the Bible is unchanging as well. And if we follow that, and we still have that same loving attitude, if someone is guilty of homosexuality and they repent of that, just like the prodigal son did, we have a loving God that's willing to receive them back. But we can't be tolerant of sinful behavior if we want to save souls. And, so anyway, let's move on to the next question. This is for Chase. These are a couple that we're going to answer. Sins that we don't talk about. This is probably best answered after a potluck. Talk about gluttony, Chase.
Yeah, I feel like I got set up on this one a little bit. Considering, that we just got out of a potluck. What is gluttony? Well, You've probably heard it talked about before. Excuse me, I did not mean to do that. You've probably heard it talked about before and have heard it put into different ways, different terms. But Webster's dictionary defines gluttony as habitual greed or excess in eating. Now, I want you to pay attention to that definition: habitual greed or excess in eating. All right? We just got out of a potluck. How many of y'all got more than one plate? How many of y'all got more than one dessert? Here's the thing about gluttony. We get hung up a lot of times on the food aspect of it. And that is true. That plays a part in it. It does have to do with excess eating. But let's look at a couple verses about this. Starting in Proverbs chapter 23, verses 20 and 21. Proverbs 23, 20 and 21. It says, "Be not among drunkards or among gluttonous eaters of meat, for the drunkard and the glutton will come to poverty, and slumber will clothe them with rags." All right. So if you're a glutton, get ready, because you are going to blow every penny that you ever had or ever made. All right, that's important to pay attention to. Now turn to Ezekiel chapter 16, verse 49. Ezekiel 16, verse 49. It says, "Behold, this was the guilt of your sister Sodom. She and her daughters had pride, excess of food, and prosperous ease, but did not aid the poor and needy." And of course, the excess of food, and that would refer to gluttony. So, what is gluttony? Well, like I said, pay attention to that definition, because, again, we get caught up in the food aspect of things. But what do you notice about these two verses? Ultimately, they have to do with one thing. Yes, food is involved, but ultimately what they have to do with is wealth. Gluttony can refer to not only an excess of food, but also an excess of wealth. You can be just as gluttonous by wasting your money on useless things that will not benefit or further the growth of the church than you can by saying, "I don't need to eat this much food, but I'm going to anyway." And as a matter of fact, where we get the idea of gluttony being one of the things that it is, being the whole food thing, is it comes from around the early 300, 400 AD. But I got this off of deadlysins.com. I know that sounds really weird.
Browser history is going to be really interesting.
I know it. I'm on a few lists, I'm sure. But no, we normally associate gluttony with being one of the quote-unquote 7 deadly sins. And by the way, if you go looking for that in the Bible, it's not there, and here's why. According to Sacred Origins of Profound Things by Charles Panatti, Greek monastic theologian Evagrius of Pontus first drew up a list of 8 offenses and wicked human passions. They were, in order of increasing seriousness, gluttony, lust, avarice, sadness, anger, acedia, I don't know what that is, vainglory, and pride. Evagrius saw the escalating severity as representing increasing fixation with the self, with pride as the most egregious of the sins. Here it is. Acedia, from the Greek akadia, or not to care, denoted spiritual sloth. In the late 6th century, Pope Gregory the Great reduced the list to 7 items, folding vainglory into pride, acedia or Arcadia into sadness, and adding envy. His ranking of the sin's seriousness was based on the degree from which they offended against love. It was, from most serious to least, pride, envy, anger, sadness, avarice, gluttony, and lust. Later theologians, including St. Thomas Aquinas, would contradict the notion that the seriousness of the sins could be ranked in this way. The term covetousness has historically been used interchangeably with avarice in accounts of the deadly sins. In the 17th century, the church replaced the vague sin of, quote, sadness with sloth. So where you get the idea of the 7 deadly sins, it doesn't come from the Bible. It comes from man, who put these lists together, and they tried to come up with some way to remember certain things and to ultimately try to grow closer to God. But the way they went about doing it a lot of times was not the way to go. So what is gluttony? What is the sin of gluttony? Well, based on what we read here, based on the definition, gluttony is not just about eating too much, eating more than you need to be. And part of the reason it would have been understood this way is the Romans actually would do this. They would hold feasts and banquets, and they would go and eat their food. And immediately after they finished one course, they would run to the bathroom, regurgitate everything into the latrines, and then go back for more. That is gluttony. But again, it's not about the food. Do not get caught up in the idea of the food. It is about the wealth. Where are you spending your wealth? What are you investing it in? Yes, we can be gluttonous with our food because ultimately, a lot of times, especially as Americans, we're bad about this. We eat more than we need. We buy food that's more expensive than some families throughout the world make in a year. We spend that money on one meal. But gluttony ultimately, within the Bible, has to do with greed. And it has to do with, are we spending all our money on ourselves? Are we spending our wealth on ourselves rather than giving back to those around us? While you're stuffing your face at your table, is your neighbor going hungry?
Yeah, I think a good example of this in the New Testament would be in 1 Corinthians chapter 11 when Paul is scolding the people for their conduct at the Lord's Supper. He said that you're not coming together to take the Lord's Supper. There's some of those among you in the church that are hungry. Others are full and drunk. And some have interpreted that as not necessarily drunk with with wine, but they're drunk on food and drunk on gluttony while others are starving. So, yeah, that's a great answer. All right, so we're going to move on. This will be our final question for today. This is one for Butch, and this is an important question for our young people and for all of us. Is it okay to drink socially?
I appreciate the opportunity to talk about this. Chase, on your sheet back there, and one of the verses that's marked is Romans 12, 1 and 2. It is a favorite passage, and Brother Curtis shared that this morning. I beseech you therefore, brethren, by the mercies of God, that you present your bodies a living sacrifice, holy, acceptable unto God, which is your reasonable service. Be not conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind, that you may prove what is that good and acceptable and perfect will of God. This morning, Jimmy did a great job about the prodigal son, but he also used a passage from 1 Peter. And I want us to look at this just for a moment. 1 Peter chapter 2. And I would ask, you might want to look at all of Romans chapter 12 as well, because it talks about Christian behavior. In 1 Peter chapter 2, Peter talks to us, and he reminds us that as newborn babes, we desire the sincere milk of the Word, that we can grow thereby. And he reminds us, beginning verse 4, to whom coming is into a living stone, disallowed indeed of men, but chosen of God and precious. Ye also as lively stones are built up a spiritual house, and holy priesthood, offer up spiritual sacrifices acceptable to God by Jesus Christ. He goes ahead and he reminds us in verse 9, you are a chosen generation, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, a peculiar people, that you should show forth the praises of him who hath called you out of darkness into this marvelous light. And then he says in verse 10, in which time past you were not a people, but now are the people of God, which had not attained mercy, but now ye have obtained mercy. Let me ask you, who are the priests in the Lord's church today? We are. Male, female, young, old. If you're a part of the family of God, you are a priest in the Lord's church today, according to 1 Peter chapter 2. Correct?
Absolutely.
Turn back with me over to the Old Testament, to the book of Leviticus, chapter 10. A well-known story that most of you would remember, especially from looking at our Bible reading, our daily Bible reading. You will remember the story of Nadab and Abihu. They were the sons of Aaron. And I really believe if you study carefully Leviticus chapter 10, Nadab and Abihu committed a sin. They offered strange fire on the incense altar. That was their job in the temple. And you've got to remember that these two men, according to the scriptures here, it implies that they were drunk when they did that. I don't know if any of you have ever been around a drunk, but I have seen some people do some very ridiculous things under the influence of alcohol. And I can tell you that personally, I really believe that alcoholism is a weakness in the human body that not everybody has. I can recall some people that had the ability to drink, and it took a lot to ever make them drunk. I can recall some other people I've known through the ages that they could drink one can of beer and they would be out of it. But I really hope that we would understand that being the priest in the church today, being the priestly tribe, male and female, chosen generation, we'd look at Leviticus 10 and consider what's being said here. I'll go back for the sake of context and start with verse 1. Nadab and Abihu, the sons of Aaron, took either of them his censer and put fire therein, and put incense thereon, and offered strange fire before the Lord, which he commanded them not. And there went out fire from the Lord and devoured them, and they died before the Lord. Then Moses said unto Aaron, This is it, that the Lord spake, saying, I will be sanctified in them that come nigh me, and before all the people I will be glorified. And Aaron held his peace. Moses called Mishael and Elzaphan, the sons of Uzziah, the uncle of Aaron, and said to them, Come near, carry your brethren from before the sanctuary out of the camp. So they went near and carried them in their coats out of the camp, as Moses said to them. And Moses said unto Aaron and to Eleazar and unto Ithamar his sons, Uncover not your heads, neither rend your clothes, lest you die, and lest wrath come upon all the people. But let your brethren, the whole house of Israel, bewail the burning which the Lord hath kindled. You shall not go out from the door of the tabernacle of the congregation, lest ye die. For the anointing oil of the Lord is upon you. And they did according to the word of Moses. Now listen to this. This is verse 8. The Lord spake unto Aaron, saying, Do not drink wine or strong drink, thou nor thy sons with thee, when you go into the tabernacle of the congregation, lest you die. It shall be a statute forever throughout your generations, that you may put a difference between holy and unholy, between unclean and clean. And listen to this one, verse 11. And that you may teach the children of Israel all the statutes which the Lord has spoken to them by the hand of Moses. You know, I realize that even in the Lord's church, there's different matters of opinion. My argument in refusing to drink wine and strong drink is the fact that I'm a priest. I believe God has forbidden his priest of ever having wine or strong drink if we're going to be serving. No, we don't go in the tabernacle today, but we come into the church. And we are the church. I think the safest thing for a Christian to do is to stay away from it. Does it happen? Yes, I know it happens. I think if we look at influence, if we look at example, if we think about all those passages that talk about us being different than the world, it's hard for us to say that on one hand and then have actions that say something else. I had somebody ask me, do you think I'm going to hell because I have one drink with my meal, or if I go to the ball game I have a beer? That's between you and the Lord. I'm not going to choose that. Matter of fact, I've been the designated driver more than one time. I'll say that.
All right, on that note, Chase is going to offer our invitation, and then we'll have our invitation song. Brother Chase.
You know, one thing I've really enjoyed about these is it gives everyone a chance to ask questions that they normally wouldn't get a chance to ask from Jeremy or Butch or myself when we stand up here. It gives people a chance to really get some information on some questions that they may have. And one thing that I've always told the kids is don't be afraid to stop and ask me a question, ever. Because if you're going through life and you're unsure of something and unsure about what your stance on something should be, take the time to sort that out. This morning, we were talking about Islam in class. We're going through different religious groups. One of the things that the book that I was using was saying about Islam is the way that Islam is written, it is not just a religion. Islam is a way of life. It controls political things. It controls how you view the world around you, how you have a relationship with those around you. And here's the sad part. We as Christians, that's supposed to be us. We talked about Romans chapter 12 and how we're supposed to not be conformed but transformed by the renewing of your minds. This book that we're answering these questions out of, this book that we're reading through this year, this book is supposed to change your life. It is supposed to change your relationships, your mindset, the way that you think, the way that you see. Everything about you should be influenced by Scripture. And so if there's ever a point in time in your life where you're not sure, where do I need to, or how should I feel about this, or what should be my opinion on this? What does this mean for me as a Christian? Don't ever be afraid to ask. There's no question that's too ridiculous. I stood up here and told you about how the earth is flat for 15 minutes. Don't ever be afraid to ask a question because you think that it's going to be a bad question. This book is supposed to be an integral part of who we are as a people. Don't ever stop studying it. Don't ever stop questioning, learning, researching, finding out. There's no such thing as stupid questions as a lot of people believe. I tell people the only stupid question I know of is when you ask a question that just got answered. But to each their own. But anyway, tonight, if you have any need, whatever it is, if maybe something that we've said, a question that we've answered has touched your heart in some way, maybe you've been thinking about some things this week, something that has been weighing heavy on your mind, please don't hesitate. This is a family. We're here to help one another. And I can tell you that these are some of the best people I know personally. And they will do anything they can to help you out. So whatever your need is, whatever it might be, please come forward as we stand and as we sing.